The wind moves across cold water. It has moved this way for thousands of years. Beneath it, the North Atlantic rolls in long, slow swells. The coastline is distant. The sky is wide and gray. There is no hurry here. There is only the rhythm of waves and the pool of currents that connect one shore to another. Somewhere between those shores, a wooden ship cuts through the water. Its sail is square and heavy with wind. The men aboard do not speak much. They know the sea. They know the stars. They know how to read the flight of birds and the color of distant clouds. They are moving between worlds that most people will never see. This is the North Atlantic in the year 850. The ship is Norse. The men are what history will call Vikings, but they do not call themselves that. They are farmers, traders, sailors. They are people shaped by long winters and short summers, by isolation and necessity, by a landscape that demanded resilience. The Viking Age lasted roughly 300 years. It began quietly, with small movements along familiar coasts. It ended quietly, with the slow absorption of Norse culture into the broader currents of medieval Europe. Between those points, the world changed. New trade routes opened. New settlements appeared on islands no one had lived on before. Kingdoms rose and fell. Languages mixed. Beliefs shifted. This is the story of that time. Not the myths, not the legends, just the long, steady progression of years and the people who lived through them. We will move through this history slowly. There is no need to rush. Each chapter will take you deeper into the timeline, from the centuries before the Viking Age began, through the early raids and explorations, into the heart of Norse society, and, finally, to the quiet end of an era. You can listen to all of it, or you can let it carry you into sleep. Either way, the story will be here. If you find comfort in this kind of history, you might want to stay with us here at Archive of Rest. We create long-form narrations designed for sleep and deep focus. No interruptions. No sudden changes in tone. Just history, told the way it might have been told around a fire, when the night was long and there was time to listen. The Viking Age is often misunderstood. It has been simplified into images of violence and conquest. But the reality was more complex. Most Norse people never left Scandinavia. They farmed, they raised children, they repaired tools and mended roofs and waited for spring. The ones who did leave were not mindless raiders. They were navigators, merchants, settlers. They were people responding to the pressures of their time: overpopulation, limited farmland, political instability, and the lure of wealth across the sea. This script will take you through the entire timeline. We will begin in the centuries before the first raid, when Scandinavia was isolated and quiet. We will watch as ships improved and ambitions grew. We will follow the Norse across the North Sea, down the rivers of Eastern Europe, across the Atlantic to Iceland and Greenland and beyond. We will see how their society functioned, what they believed, how they lived day to day. And we will watch as the Viking Age slowly faded, not with a single dramatic event, but with the gradual integration of Norse culture into the Christian kingdoms of Europe. The pace will be slow. The tone will be calm. There will be no dramatization. Violence will be mentioned when it is historically necessary, but it will not be the focus. The focus is on time itself, on the way centuries unfold, on the quiet persistence of human life in difficult places. You do not need to remember every detail. You do not need to stay awake for every chapter. This is not a test. It is simply a long, gentle walk through history. Let it settle over you. Let the names and dates and places become a soft background hum. Let the rhythm of the narration carry you wherever you need to go. We will begin now in the cold north, in the centuries before the Viking Age, when the people who would one day be called Vikings were simply people, living in a landscape that shaped everything they would become. The wind is still moving across the water. The ship is still cutting through the waves. And the story is just beginning. The land was old. The ice had only recently left. By recently, we mean thousands of years, but in the scale of geological time, it was recent. The glaciers had carved the fjords and left behind thin soil and countless lakes. The winters were long. The summers were brief and bright. The people who lived there had learned to work within those constraints. This was Scandinavia in the centuries before the Viking Age, roughly the 6th, 7th, and early 8th centuries, the late Iron Age. The people were Germanic. They spoke languages that would eventually become Old Norse. They were not yet unified. There were no kingdoms in the way we think of them. There were chieftains. There were local leaders. There were families and clans and loose networks of loyalty. The population was small. Most estimates suggest a few 100,000 people spread across what is now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. They lived in scattered farmsteads and small villages. The distances between settlements could be vast. Travel was difficult. In winter, it was nearly impossible. Communities were isolated. They relied on themselves. The geography shaped everything. Norway was a long, narrow strip of land pressed between mountains and sea. The interior was largely uninhabitable. People lived along the coast or in the valleys. Sweden had more flat land, more forests, more room to spread. Denmark was flatter still, with better soil and easier farming. But all three regions shared the same basic challenge: short growing seasons and limited arable land. Farming was the foundation of life. Barley and oats were the main crops. Rye in some areas. Vegetables in small gardens near the home. Livestock were essential: cattle, sheep, goats, pigs. Cattle were wealth. A family's status could be measured in the number of cows they owned. Milk, butter, cheese. Meat in the autumn when animals were slaughtered before winter. Hides for clothing and leather. Bone for tools. The work was seasonal and repetitive. Spring was for plowing and planting. Summer was for tending and growing. Autumn was for harvest and preparation. Winter was for survival. Families lived in longhouses. These were rectangular buildings with thick walls and turf roofs. Inside, there was a central hearth. Smoke rose through a hole in the roof. The fire was never allowed to go out completely. It was warmth. It was light. It was the center of the home. People slept on benches along the walls. They shared space with animals in the coldest months. The smell of smoke and bodies and livestock was constant. Privacy did not exist in the way we understand it. Life was communal. Everyone contributed. Children worked as soon as they were able. Women managed the household, made clothing, prepared food, and often had significant authority in family decisions. Men worked the fields, hunted, fished, and handled trade. The sea was always present. Even inland, rivers and lakes connected communities. Water was the easiest way to travel. Boats were essential. Not yet the long ships that would define the Viking Age, but smaller vessels. Rowboats, fishing boats, cargo boats. The Norse had been building boats for centuries. They understood wood and water. They understood how to shape a hull and how to read the weather. Fishing supplemented the diet. Cod, herring, salmon. In coastal areas, fish could be dried and stored. Seals were hunted. Whales, when they beached. Everything was used. Nothing was wasted. Survival required efficiency. Trade existed, but it was limited. Goods moved slowly along established routes. Furs and hides went south, iron and amber. In return, luxury items came north. Glass beads, fine textiles, silver. These were rare. Most people never saw them. Most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. There was no writing. History was oral. Stories were told and retold. Genealogies were memorized. The past was preserved in memory and passed down through generations. This created a culture deeply rooted in tradition. Change happened slowly. Innovation was gradual. The old ways were respected because they had proven to work. Religion was woven into daily life. The gods were not distant. They were part of the world. Odin, Thor, Freya. These names would become famous later, but in this period they were simply the gods people knew. There were rituals, offerings, sacred groves and stones. Belief was practical. You honored the gods because it was what you did, because your parents did, because the community did. There was no separation between the sacred and the mundane. A good harvest was a gift from the gods. A harsh winter was their displeasure. Fate was real. The idea that your life was already woven, already determined, was not fatalistic. It was simply the way things were. You still worked. You still tried. But you accepted what came. This was the world that produced the Vikings. Not a world of warriors and raiders, but a world of farmers and fishermen. A world of long dark winters and the constant need to prepare. A world where survival required cooperation and resilience. A world where the sea was both a barrier and a possibility. The changes that would lead to the Viking Age were already beginning. Population was growing. Good farmland was becoming scarce. Younger sons had fewer options. Political structures were slowly consolidating. Chieftains were becoming more powerful. Conflicts over land and resources were increasing, and the ships were improving. Slowly, over generations, Norse shipbuilders were learning to make vessels that could handle open water, that could carry more cargo, that could move faster. These improvements were not dramatic. They were incremental. A slightly different hull shape, a better sail, stronger joints. But over time, they added up. By the middle of the 8th century, Scandinavia was on the edge of something. The people did not know it yet. They were simply living their lives. Farming, fishing, raising children, telling stories, honoring the gods. But the conditions were in place. The skills were in place. The need was in place. The Viking Age was about to begin, not with a single decision or a single event, but with the slow accumulation of pressure and opportunity. With the realization that there was a world beyond the horizon, and that it could be reached. The change did not announce itself. There was no moment when someone decided the Viking Age would begin. It emerged from circumstances that had been building for generations. By the middle of the 8th century, those circumstances had reached a point where movement became inevitable. Scandinavia was running out of room. Not literally. There were still forests and mountains and empty coastlines. But the good land, the farmable land, was increasingly claimed. Families had been dividing their holdings for generations. Each son received a portion. Each generation, the portions grew smaller. Younger sons faced a choice. They could stay and work land that barely supported them. They could try to clear new ground from forest or stone, or they could look elsewhere. The population had been growing steadily. More people meant more pressure, more competition for resources, more disputes over boundaries and grazing rights. Chieftains were consolidating power. Local conflicts were becoming more common. Some families were being pushed out. Others were choosing to leave. At the same time, the Norse had become exceptional sailors. This had not happened quickly. It was the result of centuries of incremental improvement. Better tools for shaping wood. Better understanding of how a hull should curve. Better sails. Better navigation techniques passed down from father to son. By 750, Norse shipbuilders had developed vessels that could handle the North Sea. These were not yet the famous longships. Those would come later. But they were seaworthy. They could carry cargo and people. They could be rowed when there was no wind and sailed when there was. They were flexible, practical, reliable. The Norse had always known there were lands to the south and west. Traders had been moving along the coasts for generations. There were established routes to Frisia, to the Frankish kingdoms, to the British Isles. These were not unknown waters, but they had been traveled carefully, cautiously, staying close to shore when possible. What changed was confidence and need. The combination of better ships and increasing pressure at home created opportunity. Young men with no land and no prospects began to see the sea not as a barrier, but as a path. The first movements were small. A few ships, a few dozen men. They were not invasions. They were explorations, testing, learning. The goal was not conquest. It was wealth, portable wealth, silver, gold, fine cloth, wine, things that could be taken back home, things that could buy land or status or a better future. The targets were chosen carefully. Monasteries were ideal. They were wealthy. They held treasures donated by the faithful, gold and silver reliquaries, illuminated manuscripts bound in precious metals, fine vestments, and they were poorly defended. Monks were not warriors. Monasteries were built in isolated locations, often on islands or remote coastlines. They were accessible by sea, but far from any military protection. The Norse did not see these raids as sacrilege. They did not share the Christian worldview. To them, a monastery was simply a wealthy, undefended target. The moral framework that made such places sacred meant nothing to men who honored different gods. The raids were quick. A ship would arrive at dawn. Men would land, move fast, take what they could carry, and leave before any response could be organized. There was no occupation, no attempt to hold ground, just speed and surprise and the ability to disappear back across the water. These early raids were seasonal. They happened in summer when the seas were calmer and the days were long. The men who participated were not professional warriors. They were farmers who went raiding for a few months and then returned home for harvest. The line between raiding and trading was not always clear. The same ship might trade peacefully at one port and raid another. The wealth brought back from these expeditions changed things at home. It created new possibilities. A successful raider could buy land. He could attract followers. He could rise in status. This created incentive. More men wanted to try. More ships were built. The scale increased gradually. The Norse also began to learn the geography of the lands they were raiding. They mapped coastlines in their minds. They learned where rivers led. They identified safe harbors and dangerous currents. They began to understand the political landscape. Which kingdoms were strong, which were divided, where defenses were weak. This knowledge was shared. Stories were told in the longhouses during winter. Routes were described. Landmarks were noted. The collective understanding of the world beyond Scandinavia grew with each voyage. At the same time, shipbuilding continued to improve. The vessels were getting longer, sleeker, faster. The classic Viking longship was taking shape. Clinker-built, with overlapping planks, flexible enough to handle rough seas, shallow enough to navigate rivers and land on beaches. These ships were masterpieces of practical engineering. They were built by men who understood wood and water at an intimate level. The sail technology improved as well. Better weaving techniques produced stronger cloth. Better rigging allowed for more control. The Norse learned to sail closer to the wind, to make progress even in unfavorable conditions. This extended their range. It made longer voyages possible. Navigation was still an art more than a science. There were no compasses, no charts in the modern sense. But the Norse had developed sophisticated techniques. They read the sun and stars. They watched the color of the water and the behavior of birds. They used landmarks and memory. They developed a deep, intuitive sense of direction and distance. By the end of the 8th century, the pattern was established. Each summer, ships left Scandinavia. They moved along familiar routes to familiar targets. They returned with wealth. The cycle repeated. The scale grew. What had started as a few opportunistic raids was becoming a regular feature of life in coastal Scandinavia. The people in the lands being raided were beginning to notice. Monasteries that had been attacked once began to fear the summer months. Coastal communities became wary of strange sails on the horizon, but the response was still local and uncoordinated. There was no unified defense. No real understanding yet of what was happening or how to stop it. The Viking Age had begun, not with a declaration or a single dramatic event, but with the slow accumulation of voyages and raids and returning ships. With the gradual realization among the Norse that the world beyond their shores was accessible, and profitable, and waiting. The wind still moved across the water. The ships still cut through the waves, but now they were moving with purpose, with knowledge, with the confidence that comes from success. The age of expansion had started, and it would continue for 300 years. The year 793 is often given as the beginning of the Viking Age. This is because of what happened on the island of Lindisfarne, off the northeastern coast of England. A monastery stood there. It was old and respected. It held relics and treasures. It was isolated and undefended. On a summer day, ships appeared. Norse raiders landed. They moved through the monastery quickly. They took what was valuable. They killed some of the monks. They left others alive. Then they sailed away. The entire event lasted hours, perhaps less. The raid itself was not unique. Similar attacks had happened before in other places, but Lindisfarne was different because of what it represented. It was a center of learning and faith. Its destruction was recorded by literate monks who survived or heard the accounts. Their words spread. The attack became symbolic. It marked a moment when the Christian world realized something new was happening. The scholar Alcuin, who was in Francia at the time, wrote letters expressing shock and grief. He saw the raid as a sign of divine displeasure. He could not understand how such a holy place could be violated. His perspective was shaped by his faith. To him, the attack was incomprehensible, but to the Norse raiders, it was simply an opportunity. After Lindisfarne, the raids continued. They increased in frequency and range. The pattern was consistent. Ships would arrive in summer. Coastal monasteries and settlements would be targeted. Wealth would be taken. The raiders would leave before any organized response could arrive. In 794, the monastery at Jarrow was attacked. In 795, raiders struck Iona off the western coast of Scotland. Iona was raided again in 802 and 806. Each time, the pattern repeated. Fast arrival, quick violence, immediate departure. The Irish coast became a frequent target. Ireland had many monasteries, often located on small islands. These were wealthy and accessible by sea. The Norse learned the geography quickly. They identified the richest targets. They returned to them repeatedly. The raids were not random. They required planning and knowledge. The Norse needed to know when to sail, where to land, what to expect. This information was gathered over time. Each successful raid added to the collective knowledge. Routes were refined. Timing was improved. The ships used in these raids were evolving. By the early 9th century, the classic longship design was well established. These vessels were typically 60 to 80 feet long. They could carry 30 to 60 men. They were fast under sail and could be rowed when necessary. Their shallow draft meant they could navigate rivers and land directly on beaches. The flexibility of these ships was crucial. Raiders could strike far inland by following rivers. They could appear suddenly in places that seemed safe from sea-based attacks. They could retreat quickly if threatened. The ships gave them mobility that land-based forces could not match. The men who crewed these ships were not a unified force. They were independent groups. A ship might be owned by a wealthy farmer or a local chieftain. The crew would be made up of his relatives, neighbors, and hired men. Each expedition was essentially a private venture. The goal was profit. The spoils were divided among the participants. This decentralized structure made the raids difficult to counter. There was no single leader to negotiate with, no central authority to threaten or bribe. Each ship operated independently. Even if one group was defeated or driven off, others would continue. The targets began to adapt. Some monasteries were abandoned, others were fortified. Treasures were moved inland or hidden. Coastal communities became more vigilant. But these measures were reactive and incomplete. The Norse had the initiative. They could choose when and where to strike. As the raids continued, the Norse began to explore further. They moved beyond the British Isles. They raided along the Frankish coast. They entered the Seine and the Loire. They struck settlements in what is now France and the Low Countries. The Frankish Empire was larger and more organized than the British kingdoms, but it was also distracted by internal conflicts. Charlemagne had died in 814. His empire was being divided among his heirs. The resulting instability created opportunities. Coastal defenses were neglected. Local lords were focused on their own disputes. The Norse took advantage. They raided Frankish ports and monasteries. They learned that the Franks, like the English and Irish, were vulnerable to fast sea-based attacks. The wealth they found was substantial: silver, gold, wine, fine cloth. All of it could be loaded onto ships and carried home. By the 830s and 840s, the scale of raiding had increased significantly. What had started as small, opportunistic ventures had become a regular pattern. Dozens of ships were involved, hundreds of men. The economic impact on Scandinavia was noticeable. Wealth was flowing in. This wealth created new social dynamics. Successful raiders gained status and followers. They could afford better equipment. They could fund larger expeditions. The raids also began to change in character. Some groups started to overwinter in the lands they were raiding. Instead of returning to Scandinavia each autumn, they would establish temporary camps. This allowed them to raid year-round. It also meant they began to learn more about the local politics and geography. In 841, Norse raiders established a long fort, a ship camp, at Dublin. This was more than a temporary base. It was a fortified settlement. It allowed the Norse to control the surrounding area, to demand tribute, to trade as well as raid. Dublin would become a major Norse center, lasting for centuries. Similar camps were established elsewhere, on islands, at river mouths, anywhere that offered protection and access to raiding routes. These bases changed the dynamic. The Norse were no longer just visitors. They were becoming a permanent presence. The people being raided struggled to respond. Kings and lords tried various strategies. Some paid tribute, hoping to buy peace. This rarely worked for long. The Norse would take the payment and return the next year for more. Some rulers tried to fortify their coasts, but the coastlines were too long and the resources too limited. A few leaders had more success. In Wessex, King Egbert managed to defeat a Norse force in 838. But such victories were rare. Most of the time, the Norse could simply move to a different target. Their mobility was their greatest advantage. The period from 800 to 850 established the pattern that would define much of the Viking Age. Regular raiding, increasing scale, growing knowledge of European geography and politics, the establishment of permanent bases, and the flow of wealth back to Scandinavia, which funded further expansion. The Norse were learning. Each voyage taught them something new. Each raid refined their tactics. Each season added to their confidence. They were no longer tentative explorers. They were experienced raiders who understood their advantages and how to exploit them. The wind still moved across the water. The ships still cut through the waves. But now there were more of them, and they were moving with the assurance that comes from repeated success. The early phase of the Viking Age was complete. The next phase would be even more ambitious. Behind the raids and the voyages, there was ordinary life. Most Norse people never left Scandinavia. They never saw a foreign shore or participated in a raid. They lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. They farmed. They raised families. They grew old in the same landscape their ancestors had known. Understanding Viking society means understanding this reality. The raiders were a minority. The majority were farmers, craftspeople, and laborers whose lives revolved around the seasons and the demands of survival in a harsh climate. Norse society was hierarchical, but not rigid. At the top were the jarls, the earls, the wealthy landowners who controlled large estates and had many followers. Below them were the carls, the free farmers who owned their own land. At the bottom were the thralls, the slaves, who had no freedom and no rights. But these categories were not absolute. A successful farmer could accumulate wealth and rise in status. A poor freeman could fall into debt and lose his freedom. A slave could sometimes earn or buy his freedom. Movement was possible, though not common. The basic unit of society was the family. Extended families lived together or near each other. Loyalty to family was paramount. If someone was wronged, the family was expected to seek compensation or revenge. If someone prospered, the family shared in that prosperity. Individual identity was inseparable from family identity. The household was managed by both husband and wife, though their roles were distinct. Men handled the outdoor work: farming, hunting, fishing, building, trading. Women managed the household: food preparation, textile production, child rearing, and often the day-to-day running of the farm when men were away. Women in Norse society had more rights than in many other European cultures of the time. They could own property, they could inherit, they could divorce. A woman could manage a farm in her husband's absence. She held the keys to the household stores, a symbol of her authority. In the sagas, women are often portrayed as strong-willed and influential. Children were valued, but childhood was brief. By age 7 or 8, children were expected to contribute to the household work. Boys learned farming, hunting, and basic combat skills. Girls learned textile work, food preparation, and household management. Education was practical and hands-on. The longhouse was the center of life. These buildings were typically 60 to 100 feet long and 15 to 20 feet wide. The walls were made of wood or stone, depending on what was available. The roof was turf, which provided insulation. Inside, there was a central hearth that ran much of the length of the building. The fire was essential. It provided heat, light, and a place to cook. Smoke rose through holes in the roof or simply filtered through the turf. The interior was dim and smoky. People sat on benches along the walls. These benches also served as beds. Privacy was minimal. Everyone lived in close proximity. Storage was built into the structure. Barrels and chests held food and supplies. Tools hung on the walls. Weapons were kept close at hand. Everything had its place because space was limited and organization was necessary. Food was simple and repetitive. Porridge made from barley or oats was a staple. Bread when grain was available. Dairy products were crucial. Milk, butter, cheese, skyr. Meat was eaten but not daily. Cattle were too valuable to slaughter regularly. Sheep and goats were more common sources of meat. Pork when pigs were raised. Fish was important, especially in coastal areas. Dried fish could be stored for months. Herring, cod, salmon, seals when they could be caught. Whale meat when a whale beached or was successfully hunted. Vegetables came from small gardens. Cabbage, onions, peas, beans. Wild plants were gathered. Berries in summer. Nuts in autumn. Herbs for flavoring and medicine. Nothing was wasted. Every part of every plant and animal was used. Preservation was critical. Food had to last through the winter. Meat was smoked or salted. Fish was dried. Dairy was made into cheese. Grain was stored carefully to prevent spoilage. A failed harvest or a harsh winter could mean starvation. Clothing was made at home. Wool was the primary material. Sheep were sheared in spring. The wool was cleaned, carded, spun into thread, and woven into cloth. This was time-consuming work, done primarily by women. A single garment could represent hundreds of hours of labor. Men typically wore a tunic and trousers. Women wore a long dress with an overdress or apron. Both wore cloaks fastened with brooches. Leather shoes or boots. In winter, furs and extra layers. Clothing was practical and durable. It was mended repeatedly. Nothing was discarded until it was completely worn out. Personal hygiene was valued. The Norse bathed regularly, more so than many of their European contemporaries. They had combs, tweezers, and ear spoons. They cared about their appearance. This is noted in historical accounts by outsiders who were sometimes surprised by how clean and well-groomed the Norse were. Work was constant and seasonal. Spring meant plowing and planting. The fields had to be prepared. Seeds had to be sown. This was urgent work. The growing season was short. Every day mattered. Summer was for tending, weeding, protecting crops from animals, cutting hay for winter fodder, fishing, gathering, repairing tools and buildings. There was always something that needed doing. Autumn was harvest. This was the most critical time of year. Everything depended on bringing in the crops successfully. Grain had to be cut, threshed, and stored. Animals that could not be fed through winter were slaughtered. The meat was preserved. Nothing could be left to chance. Winter was for survival and maintenance. The days were short and dark. Outdoor work was limited. This was the time for indoor tasks, repairing tools, making new equipment, spinning and weaving, telling stories, waiting for spring. Social life revolved around the community. Neighbors helped each other with large tasks, barn raisings, harvests, celebrations. Disputes were settled at local assemblies, called things. These were gatherings where free men could speak, present grievances, and seek justice. The thing was central to Norse governance. It was democratic in a limited sense. Free men had a voice. Decisions were made collectively. Laws were recited and remembered. There was no written code. Justice was based on tradition and consensus. Feuds were common. If someone was killed or injured, compensation was expected. This was usually paid in silver or goods. If compensation was refused, the victim's family had the right to seek revenge. This could lead to cycles of violence that lasted generations. The thing existed partly to mediate these disputes and prevent endless feuding. Religion was woven into daily life. Small rituals marked important moments. Offerings were made for good harvests, safe voyages, healthy children. There were larger ceremonies at certain times of year. Sacrifices of animals, sometimes at sacred sites. Feasts where the community gathered. The gods were not distant. They were part of the world. Thor controlled the weather. Freya influenced fertility. Odin governed fate and wisdom. People did not worship in the way Christians did. There were no churches or regular services. Religion was practical and integrated into the rhythm of life. Entertainment was simple. Stories were the primary form. Long winter nights were spent listening to tales of gods and heroes, of ancestors and distant lands. These stories preserved history and values. They taught lessons. They connected the present to the past. Music existed. Simple instruments, flutes, lyres, drums. Singing, poetry was highly valued. The ability to compose and recite verses was a mark of education and status. Skalds, professional poets, were respected and well paid. Games were played. Board games like Hanafatafel, physical contests, wrestling, running, throwing. These built skills and provided competition. Children played with simple toys, carved figures, balls, imagination. This was the daily reality for most Norse people. Hard work, close community, limited resources, deep connection to the land and the seasons. The raids and explorations that define the Viking Age in popular imagination were undertaken by a small percentage of the population. For everyone else, life was about survival, family, and the endless cycle of planting and harvest. The longhouse was warm. The fire was burning. Outside, the wind moved through the darkness. Inside, people sat together, close and quiet, waiting for spring. The Norse did not have a word for religion in the way we understand it. Belief was not separate from life. It was woven into everything. The gods were real. The spirits were present. The world was full of forces that could help or harm. The cosmos had structure. There were 9 worlds, connected by Yggdrasil, the world tree. This was an ash tree of immense size. Its roots reached into different realms. Its branches held up the sky. It was the axis around which everything turned. Asgard was the realm of the gods. The Aesir lived there. Odin, Thor, Frigg, Tyr. They dwelt in great halls and watched over the other worlds. Midgard was the realm of humans. It was encircled by ocean. Beyond the ocean was Jotunheim, the land of giants. These were not the gods' enemies exactly, but they were different. Chaotic, dangerous, necessary. There were other realms. Vanaheim, home of the Vanir, another group of gods associated with fertility and prosperity. Alfheim, where the light elves lived. Svartalfheim, realm of the dwarves who crafted wondrous objects. Niflheim, a place of ice and mist. Muspelheim, a realm of fire. And Helheim, where many of the dead went. The gods were not all powerful. They were strong and wise, but they had limitations. They could be tricked. They could be wounded. They would eventually die. This was known. Ragnarok, the end of the world, was coming. The gods would fight. Most would fall. The world would burn and then be reborn. This was fate. It could not be changed. Odin was the All-Father. He was associated with wisdom, war, poetry, and magic. He had sacrificed one of his eyes to gain knowledge. He had hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 days to learn the runes. He was cunning and sometimes cruel. He gathered the souls of warriors who died in battle, bringing them to Valhalla, his hall, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok. Thor was more straightforward. He was the god of thunder. He protected Midgard from giants and monsters. He wielded Mjolnir, a hammer that always returned to his hand. He was strong and brave. Common people called on Thor more than any other god. He was reliable, protective. He represented the order that kept chaos at bay. Freya was the goddess of love, fertility, and war. She was beautiful and powerful. She had her own hall where she received half of those who died in battle. The other half went to Odin. She wore a necklace called Brisingamen. She could take the form of a falcon. She was associated with magic and prophecy. Frigg was Odin's wife. She knew the fate of all beings but rarely spoke of it. She was associated with marriage and motherhood. She was wise and respected. Tyr was the god of law and justice. He had sacrificed his hand to bind Fenrir, the great wolf. He was brave and honorable. He represented the order that a society depended on. Loki was complicated. He was not exactly a god, though he lived among them. He was a giant by birth. He was clever and unpredictable. Sometimes he helped the gods. Sometimes he caused them trouble. He would eventually betray them at Ragnarok. But until then, he was part of their world. These gods were not worshipped in temples. There were no churches, no organized priesthood. Worship was personal and communal. Offerings were made at sacred sites, groves of trees, large stones, springs, places where the boundary between worlds felt thin. Sacrifices were common, animals usually, horses, cattle, pigs. The meat would be cooked and eaten in a communal feast. The gods received their portion through the ritual. The community received sustenance and the sense of connection to the divine. Human sacrifice occurred, though how often is debated. The sources are unclear and often written by outsiders. It seems to have been rare and reserved for extreme circumstances, times of great crisis or important transitions. The dead were treated with care. Burial practices varied. Some were buried in the ground. Some were cremated. Grave goods were common. Tools, weapons, jewelry, even ships. These items were meant to accompany the dead into the next world. The afterlife was not uniform. Warriors who died in battle might go to Valhalla or Freya's hall. Others went to Helheim, which was not a place of punishment but simply where the dead resided. It was cold and dim, but not torturous. Some believed the dead remained near their burial mounds, watching over their descendants. Fate was central to Norse belief. The Norns were three beings who wove the threads of fate. They determined the course of every life. What would happen was already decided. This did not lead to passivity. You still acted. You still fought. But you accepted the outcome. What mattered was how you faced your fate. Courage and honor were what endured. This belief in fate shaped behavior. It made the Norse fatalistic, but not hopeless. If your death was already determined, there was no point in fear. You might as well be brave. You might as well seek glory. Your reputation, your memory, was what would last. Magic existed. It was called Seder. It was associated with prophecy and manipulation of fate. It was practiced mostly by women, though some men learned it. Odin himself practiced Seder. But for a man to do so was considered somewhat shameful. It was seen as unmanly. This tension between the power of magic and the social stigma around it was never fully resolved. Runes were more than an alphabet. They were symbols of power. Each rune had meaning beyond its sound. They could be carved for protection, for luck, for curses. Rune stones marked graves and commemorated deeds. The ability to read and carve runes was valuable. The Norse believed in many kinds of spirits. Landvætter, spirits of the land. They inhabited rocks, trees, waterfalls. They had to be respected. If you settled new land, you made offerings to the Landvætter. If you angered them, misfortune would follow. There were also the Desire, female spirits, associated with families. They protected the household. They were honored at certain times of year. And there were elves, dwarves, and other beings that existed alongside humans, sometimes helping, sometimes hindering. Dreams were significant. They were messages, prophecies. The boundary between waking and sleeping was not absolute. What you saw in dreams could be as real as what you saw with open eyes. Prophecy was valued. Volvas, seeresses, could see the future. They were consulted before important decisions. They went into trances and spoke what they saw. Their words were taken seriously. This worldview was coherent. It explained suffering and success. It provided meaning. It connected people to their ancestors and to the land. It gave structure to the chaos of existence. When Christianity began to arrive in Scandinavia, it did not immediately replace these beliefs. For a long time, the two coexisted. People might be baptized, but still make offerings to Thor. They might attend church, but still believe in the Landvætter. The transition was gradual and complicated. But in the early Viking Age, Christianity was still foreign. The Norse gods were the only gods most people knew. The stories of Odin and Thor were the stories that explained the world. The rituals were the rituals that had always been performed. The fire burned in the longhouse. Outside, the wind moved through the darkness. The gods were watching. Fate was being woven, and the people went about their lives, honoring what had always been honored, believing what had always been believed. In the autumn of 865, a fleet arrived on the coast of East Anglia. It was larger than any that had come before. The sources call it the Great Heathen Army, though it was not an army in the formal sense. It was a coalition, multiple groups, multiple leaders. But they had come together with a shared purpose. The leaders included Ivar, Halfdan, and Ubba, said to be sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Whether Ragnar was a real person or a legendary figure is unclear. The sources mix history and myth. But his sons were real. They commanded ships and men. They had experience and ambition. This force was different from earlier raids. It was not coming for a quick strike and retreat. It came to stay, to conquer, to take land. The men who came were not just raiders. Many were settlers. They brought equipment for a long campaign. They were prepared to spend years in England. East Anglia was the first target. The local king, Edmund, tried to negotiate. He provided horses. This was significant. The Norse had always been limited by their inability to move quickly inland. Horses changed that. They could now strike deep into the interior and retreat before defenses could be organized. The army moved north into Northumbria. The kingdom was divided by internal conflict. Two rival kings were fighting for control. The Norse took advantage. They captured York in 866. The city was called Jorvik by the Norse. It would become a major Norse settlement, lasting for generations. The Northumbrian kings tried to retake the city in 867. They failed. Both were killed. Northumbria effectively ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. The Norse installed a puppet ruler and controlled the region. From York, the army moved south. They entered Mercia in 867. Mercia was one of the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but it too was weakened by internal divisions. The Norse established a base at Nottingham. The Mercian king, Burgred, called for help from Wessex. King Ethelred of Wessex came with an army, but no major battle occurred. A truce was arranged. The Norse withdrew temporarily. In 869, the army returned to East Anglia. King Edmund refused to submit. He was captured and killed. The details are unclear. Later, Christian sources claim he was martyred, shot with arrows and beheaded. He became Saint Edmund. But the immediate result was clear. East Anglia fell under Norse control. The pattern was consistent. The Norse would arrive, establish a fortified camp, and use it as a base for controlling the surrounding territory. They did not try to hold every village and town. They controlled key points, rivers, roads, fortified positions. From these, they could dominate the region. In 871, the army moved into Wessex. This was the last major Anglo-Saxon kingdom still independent. King Ethelred and his brother Alfred led the defense. There were multiple battles. At Ashdown, the West Saxons won a significant victory. But other battles went to the Norse. The fighting was intense and costly for both sides. Ethelred died in 871. Alfred became king. He was young, in his early 20s. He inherited a kingdom under severe pressure. The Norse were camped at Reading. They controlled much of the Thames Valley. Alfred had to buy peace. He paid tribute. The Norse withdrew temporarily, but the respite was brief. In 876, a new Norse force under Guthrum moved into Wessex. They established a base at Wareham. Alfred besieged them. Guthrum agreed to leave. He swore oaths, but he broke them. The Norse moved to Exeter. Alfred pursued. Again, Guthrum agreed to terms. Again, he broke them. In January 878, Guthrum launched a surprise attack. It was midwinter, a time when campaigning was unusual. The Norse struck Chippenham, where Alfred was staying. Alfred barely escaped. He fled into the marshes of Somerset with a small group of followers. This was the lowest point. Most of Wessex was under Norse control. Alfred was in hiding. It seemed the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom would fall, but Alfred did not surrender. He used the marshes as a base. He gathered loyal men. He sent messages. He prepared. In May 878, Alfred emerged. He called up the Fyrd, the militia of free men. They gathered at Egbert's Stone. The army marched to Eddington. Guthrum's forces were there. The battle was decisive. The Norse were defeated. They retreated to their fortification at Chippenham. Alfred besieged them. After 2 weeks, Guthrum surrendered. This time, the terms were different. Guthrum agreed to be baptized. He agreed to leave Wessex, and, most importantly, a boundary was established. The Treaty of Wedmore, as it came to be known, divided England. Wessex and western Mercia remained under Anglo-Saxon control. The north and east became the Danelaw, the region where Norse law and customs prevailed. This was not a complete victory for either side, but it was a turning point. Alfred had survived. Wessex remained independent. The Norse had gained vast territories, but they had been denied, stopped from total conquest. The Danelaw was not a unified kingdom. It was a patchwork of Norse-controlled territories. York was a major center. The 5 boroughs, Leicester, Nottingham, Derby, Stamford, and Lincoln, were important towns. East Anglia was settled by Norse farmers. The land was divided. Estates were established. Many of the warriors who had come with the great heathen army settled down. They took land. They married local women. They farmed. The transition from raider to settler was gradual but real. Within a generation, these Norse settlers were part of the landscape. The cultural impact was significant. Norse words entered the English language. Place names changed. Legal customs blended. In the Danelaw, Norse and Anglo-Saxon communities lived side by side. Sometimes they fought. Often they traded. Always they influenced each other. Alfred used the breathing space to strengthen Wessex. He built fortifications called burhs. These were fortified towns placed strategically throughout the kingdom. They provided refuge for the population and bases for military response. He reorganized the fyrd so that part of it was always ready to fight. He built ships to counter Norse naval superiority. These reforms took years, but they worked. When Norse forces attacked again in the 890s, Wessex was ready. The attacks were repelled. Alfred's son, Edward, and grandson Athelstan would eventually reconquer the Danelaw. But that would take decades. The great heathen army changed England permanently. It ended the old order of multiple Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It created the Danelaw, a region where Norse culture took root. It forced the surviving Anglo-Saxon kingdom to adapt and strengthen, and it demonstrated that the Norse were not just raiders. They were conquerors and settlers who could reshape the political landscape. The army had come in 865 with ships and weapons. By 878, many of those warriors were farmers with families and land. The transformation was complete. The Viking Age had entered a new phase. Not just raiding, but settlement. Not just taking wealth, but taking territory. The Norse were no longer visitors, they were residents, and England would never be the same. While the Norse were raiding and settling in the west, others were moving east. The rivers of Eastern Europe offered a different kind of opportunity. Not quick raids on monasteries, but long-distance trade. Access to markets that stretched all the way to Constantinople and Baghdad. The Norse who moved east were called Russ. The name may have come from a Finnish word for Swedes, or from a Norse word meaning rowers. The origin is debated, but the identity was clear. These were Scandinavians, mostly from Sweden, who traveled the river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine. The geography made this possible. Rivers like the Volga, the Dnieper, and the Dwina connected the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. These were natural highways, but they were not easy to navigate. There were rapids, portages where boats had to be carried overland, hostile territories. The journey required skill and determination. The Rus established trading posts along these rivers. Staraya Ladoga was one of the earliest, founded in the mid-8th century. It sat on the Volkhov River, connecting the Baltic to the interior. Novgorod became another major center. Kiev, on the Dnieper, would become the most important of all. These settlements were different from the raiding camps in the west. They were commercial centers, places where goods were collected, stored, and transported. The Rus traded with the local Slavic and Finnic populations. They also pushed further south, making contact with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphate. The goods they carried were valuable: furs from the northern forests, amber from the Baltic coast, slaves captured in raids or purchased from local tribes, honey and wax. These moved south. In return came silver, silk, spices, wine, and fine metalwork. The profits were substantial. Silver was especially important. The Islamic world had vast quantities of it, mined in Central Asia and minted into coins called dirhams. These coins flowed north along the trade routes. Thousands of them have been found in Scandinavian hoards. They were melted down, made into jewelry and arm rings, used as currency. The flow of silver from the east was one of the major sources of wealth in the Viking Age. The Rus were not just traders, they were also warriors. The river routes passed through territories controlled by various tribes and kingdoms. Safe passage had to be negotiated or enforced. The Rus traveled in armed groups. Their ships were similar to those used in the West. Shallow draft, capable of being rowed or sailed, able to be portaged when necessary. The Byzantine Empire called them Varangians. Byzantine sources describe their arrival in Constantinople. They came as traders and as mercenaries. The Byzantine emperors hired Varangian guards. These were elite troops, well-paid and loyal. Service in the Varangian Guard was prestigious. It offered wealth and status. Many Norsemen traveled east specifically for this opportunity. The relationship between the Rus and the Byzantines was complex. There was trade, there was military service, but there was also conflict. In 860, a Rus fleet attacked Constantinople. The attack was repelled, but it demonstrated the reach and ambition of the Norse. Similar attacks occurred in 907 and 941. Each time, treaties followed. Trade agreements, promises of access to Byzantine markets. The Rus also interacted with the Khazars, a powerful Turkic people who controlled the lower Volga. The Khazars were middlemen in the trade between north and south. Relations alternated between cooperation and conflict. The Rus eventually displaced Khazar influence in the region, but this took time. Further south, the Rus reached the Islamic Caliphate. Arab sources describe them. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat, encountered a group of Rus on the Volga in 922. His account is detailed. He describes their appearance, their customs, their burial practices. He is both fascinated and horrified. The Russi seemed barbaric to him, but he also recognized their importance as traders. The trade networks were extensive. Goods from Scandinavia reached Baghdad. Goods from the Islamic world reached Sweden. The distances were immense. The journey could take months or years, but the profits justified the risk. These eastern routes were as important as the western raids. They brought wealth into Scandinavia. They connected the Norse to the wider world. They created relationships that lasted for generations. The Rus who settled in the east gradually blended with the local Slavic populations. They adopted local customs and languages, but they also left their mark. The very name Russia may derive from the Rus. In the West, trade was also important, though it is often overshadowed by the raids. The Norse traded extensively with the Frankish Empire, with England, with Ireland. They sold furs, walrus ivory, and slaves. They bought wine, grain, weapons, and luxury goods. Dublin became a major trading center. It was founded as a Norse settlement in 841. By the late 9th century, it was a thriving port. Goods from across the Norse world passed through Dublin. It connected Ireland to Scandinavia, to England to the continent. The town had a mixed population: Norse settlers, Irish locals, traders from many lands. York was similar. After its capture in 866, it became a major Norse city. It had workshops producing metalwork, textiles, and leather goods. It had markets where goods from across the known world could be found. Coins were minted there. The city was cosmopolitan in a way that few places in northern Europe were at the time. The Norse were not just raiders and warriors. They were merchants and craftsmen. They understood value and exchange. They built networks that spanned continents. They moved goods and ideas across vast distances. The ships that made this possible were marvels of engineering. The Nar was the cargo ship of the Viking Age. It was wider and deeper than the longship. It could carry more weight. It was designed for trade, not war. These ships crossed the North Sea regularly. They carried timber from Norway to treeless Iceland. They brought grain from England to Scandinavia. They moved goods between markets separated by hundreds of miles of open water. Navigation on these voyages was sophisticated. The Norse used the sun and stars. They watched the color of the water and the behavior of birds. They had mental maps built from generations of experience. They knew the routes. They knew the dangers. They knew where to find shelter and fresh water. The trade networks created wealth, but they also created connections. Ideas moved along the trade routes, technologies, stories. The Norse were exposed to Christianity through trade long before they were converted. They saw Byzantine art and Islamic metalwork. They learned new techniques and brought them home. This exchange went both ways. Norse shipbuilding techniques influenced other cultures. Norse art styles spread. The distinctive interlace patterns and animal motifs appeared in places the Norse traded. Cultural influence followed economic influence. By the late 9th century, the Norse were integrated into the economic systems of Europe and beyond. They were not isolated northerners. They were participants in a vast network of exchange that stretched from the Atlantic to the Caspian, from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. The Viking Age was not just about raids. It was about connection, about the movement of people and goods and ideas across distances that had previously seemed impossible. The rivers still flowed. The ships still moved. And the world was becoming smaller, more connected, more complex. The Atlantic was vast and empty. Beyond the familiar coasts of Britain and Ireland, there was only water. But the Norse kept pushing further. They were looking for new land, new opportunities, places where they could settle without the constraints of the Old World. Iceland was discovered by accident. Norse sailors blown off course found it in the mid-9th century. The first reports described a land of fire and ice, volcanoes, glaciers, but also green valleys and good grazing land. And most importantly, it was uninhabited. A few Irish monks may have been there earlier. They left no permanent settlements. When the Norse arrived, the island was empty. This was unusual. Most places the Norse went were already occupied. Iceland offered something rare: unclaimed land. The settlement of Iceland began in earnest around 870. A Norwegian chieftain named Ingolfur Arnarson is traditionally credited as the first permanent settler. He established a farm at a place he called Reykjavik, the Bay of Smoke, named for the geothermal steam rising from the ground. Others followed. The migration was substantial. Thousands of people left Norway over the next few decades. They were fleeing political consolidation. King Harald Fairhair was unifying Norway, and many chieftains did not want to submit to his authority. Iceland offered freedom, independence, land. The journey was dangerous. The North Atlantic was unpredictable. Storms could appear suddenly. Ships could be lost. But the Norse cargo ship, was capable. Families loaded their possessions, their livestock, their tools. They sailed west into the unknown. Iceland was different from Scandinavia. There were no trees suitable for shipbuilding. Timber had to be imported. But there was good grazing land. The climate was milder than expected, warmed by ocean currents. Sheep thrived. Cattle could be raised. Fish were abundant in the surrounding waters. The settlers established farms in the coastal areas and the interior, valleys. They built turf houses similar to those in Scandinavia. They adapted to the new environment. They learned which plants were edible, which areas were safe, where the best fishing was. By 930, most of the usable land was claimed. The population was around 20 to 30,000. The settlers established the Althing, an assembly where disputes could be settled and laws could be made. It met each summer at Thingvellir, a dramatic rift valley. The Althing was one of the earliest forms of parliamentary government. All free men could attend and speak. Iceland had no king. It was a commonwealth. Power was distributed among the chieftains. This created a unique political structure. It was unstable at times. Feuds were common, but it also preserved a degree of individual freedom that was rare in medieval Europe. From Iceland, the Norse pushed further west. Greenland was sighted in the 980s. Eric the Red, who had been exiled from Iceland for killing a man, explored the coast. He found fjords similar to those in Norway. He found land that could support farming, at least in the southern regions. Eric returned to Iceland and recruited settlers. He called the new land Greenland. The name was partly marketing. The land was not particularly green, but it was not entirely ice either. The southern coast had grass and low vegetation. It could support livestock. The settlement of Greenland began around 985. Two main areas were colonized: the eastern settlement, which was actually on the southern tip, and the western settlement, further up the coast. At their peak, these settlements had a population of around 3,000 to 5,000. Life in Greenland was harder than in Iceland. The growing season was shorter. The climate was harsher. But the settlers adapted. They raised sheep and cattle. They hunted seals and caribou. They traded walrus ivory and polar bear hides back to Europe. These goods were valuable. They provided the income needed to import grain and timber. The Greenland settlements were isolated. Ships came from Iceland and Norway, but not frequently. The communities were small and self-reliant. They built churches. They maintained Norse customs. They survived for centuries in one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. From Greenland, the Norse reached North America. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west around the year 1000. He found land, forests, rivers. He called one place Vinland, possibly because of wild grapes or berries he found there. The exact location of Vinland is debated. But archaeological evidence at Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland confirms a Norse presence. The site has the remains of several buildings, Norse artifacts. It was a temporary settlement occupied for only a few years. The Norse attempted to settle in North America, but they did not succeed. The indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called Skraelings, were numerous and hostile. There were conflicts. The Norse were too few and too far from support. After a few years, they abandoned the attempt, but they had reached North America. 500 years before Columbus, they had crossed the Atlantic. They had established a presence, however brief, on a new continent. This was the furthest extent of Norse expansion. These Atlantic settlements were remarkable. They represented a willingness to venture into the unknown, to cross vast distances, to settle in harsh, isolated places. The people who made these journeys were not desperate refugees. They were farmers and families looking for opportunity. The settlements also demonstrated Norse adaptability. They learned to live in environments very different from Scandinavia. They developed new techniques. They maintained their culture while adapting to new circumstances. Iceland thrived. It became a center of literature and learning. The sagas, the great prose narratives of the Norse world, were written down in Iceland. The island preserved traditions that were being lost elsewhere. Greenland survived for centuries. The settlements lasted until the 15th century. Then they disappeared. The reasons are unclear. Climate change. The Little Ice Age made farming even more difficult. Trade routes shifted. Contact with Europe became less frequent. The population may have died out or been absorbed by the Inuit. The ruins of their farms and churches remain, a silent testimony to their presence. Vinland was abandoned quickly, but the memory persisted. The sagas told of the land to the west, of forests and wild grapes, of conflicts with the Skraelings. The stories were passed down. And centuries later, when Europeans returned to North America, they found echoes of the Norse presence. The Atlantic settlements were the edge of the Norse world. Beyond them was only ocean. The Norse had reached as far as they could go. They had found new lands. They had built new communities. And they had proven that the Atlantic, vast as it was, could be crossed. The wind still moved across the water. The waves still rolled. But now there were Norse farms on distant shores. There were children being born who had never seen Scandinavia. There were new stories being told in new places. The world had expanded. The 9th and 10th centuries brought change to Scandinavia. The old order of independent chieftains and local power was giving way to something new. Kings were emerging, men who claimed authority over entire regions, who built armies and demanded loyalty, who sought to unify territories that had always been fragmented. Harald Fairhair is traditionally credited as the first king of Norway. The sources are unclear about the details. The sagas tell stories that mix history and legend. But the basic pattern is clear. In the late 9th century, Harald defeated his rivals and claimed kingship over much of Norway. His methods were direct. He fought battles. He made alliances. He forced submission. Those who would not submit often left. Many of the settlers who went to Iceland were fleeing Harald's consolidation of power. They preferred independence to kingship. Harald's reign established a precedent. Norway could be unified. A single ruler could claim authority over the scattered communities along the coast. But maintaining that authority was difficult. Norway's geography worked against centralization. The fjords and mountains isolated communities. Communication was slow. Local chieftains retained significant power. After Harold's death, his sons fought over the succession. This pattern would repeat throughout the Viking Age. Kingship was not automatically hereditary in the way it would become later. Multiple sons had claims. Rivals emerged. Civil war was common. In Denmark, similar processes were occurring. Gorm the Old is considered the first historical king of a unified Denmark. His son, Harald Bluetooth, expanded Danish power in the mid-10th century. Harald is remembered for two things: his political consolidation and his conversion to Christianity. Christianity had been present in Scandinavia for generations. Missionaries had come. Some Norse had been baptized during travels abroad. But Christianity had not taken root. The old gods remained dominant. The old practices continued. Harald Bluetooth's conversion around 965 was political as much as spiritual. Christianity was the religion of the powerful kingdoms to the south, the Frankish Empire, the German kingdoms, England. Conversion opened diplomatic possibilities. It legitimized royal authority in ways the old religion did not. Harold erected a rune stone at Jelling that proclaimed his achievements. The inscription reads, "King Harold ordered this monument made in memory of Gorm, his father, and in memory of Tyrve, his mother. That Harold, who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway, and made the Danes Christian." The claim about Norway was exaggerated. But the claim about making the Danes Christian was significant. It marked an official shift. Churches were built. Missionaries were supported. The old practices were discouraged, though they continued in private for generations. The conversion of Scandinavia was gradual and uneven. It happened over more than 2 centuries. It was driven by kings who saw political advantage in Christianity, but it was resisted by many who held to the old ways. In Norway, Olaf Tryggvason became king in 995. He was a zealous Christian. He had been baptized in England. He returned to Norway determined to convert his people. His methods were harsh. He destroyed temples. He forced baptisms. He killed or exiled those who refused. Olaf's reign was short. He died in battle in 1000, but his efforts accelerated the Christianization of Norway. His successor, Olaf Haraldsson, later known as Saint Olaf, continued the process. Olaf Haraldsson was killed in battle in 1030. He was quickly venerated as a martyr. His cult became central to Norwegian Christianity. In Sweden, the process was slower. The temple at Uppsala remained a center of the old religion well into the 11th century. Swedish kings converted, but their authority was limited. Local communities retained their traditional practices longer than in Norway or Denmark. Iceland converted officially in the year 1000. The decision was made at the Althing. It was a political compromise. The Christian faction and the pagan faction were on the verge of civil war. A respected law speaker named Thorgeir was asked to decide. He spent a day and a night under a cloak, thinking. Then he announced that Iceland would be Christian, but private worship of the old gods would be tolerated. This pragmatic approach was typical of the Icelandic character. The conversion was official but not absolute. People adapted. They blended old and new. Christian churches were built on sites that had been sacred to the old gods. Saints took on characteristics of the old deities. The transition was gradual. The Christianization of Scandinavia changed the culture fundamentally. The old oral traditions began to be written down. Monasteries became centers of learning. Latin literacy spread. The Norse became part of the broader Christian world of medieval Europe, but the change was not complete or uniform. The sagas, written down in Christian Iceland, preserved memories of the pagan past. They told stories of the old gods. They described the old customs. They kept alive a worldview that was officially abandoned. The conversion also changed political structures. Christian kingship was different from the old chieftainships. Kings claimed divine sanction. They built alliances with the church. They used Christian ideology to legitimize their authority. The church, in turn, supported royal power. This alliance between throne and altar would shape Scandinavian politics for centuries. But in the Viking Age, it was still new. The old ways were still remembered. The old gods were still invoked, quietly in private. The transition was happening, but it was not yet complete. By the early 11th century, Scandinavia was nominally Christian. Churches stood where temples had been. Kings were baptized. Missionaries moved freely. But beneath the surface, the old beliefs persisted. They mixed with the new. They adapted. They survived in folklore and custom and the deep memory of the people. The wind still moved across the land. The seasons still turned. The people still farmed and fished and told stories. But the stories were changing. The gods were fading into legend. The world was becoming Christian. And the Viking Age was entering its final phase. The 11th century brought a different kind of Viking activity. The age of exploration and settlement was largely over. Iceland and Greenland were established. The Danelaw in England had been reconquered by the Anglo-Saxons. The eastern trade routes were mature and stable. What remained was politics, the struggle for power among Scandinavian kings and their attempts to control territories abroad. Knut the Great represents this new phase. He was the son of Sweyn Forkbeard, king of Denmark. Sweyn had conquered England in 1013, but he died shortly after. Knut inherited his father's ambitions. He returned to England in 1015 with a large fleet. The English king, Aethelred the Unready, had died. His son Edmund Ironside fought Knut for control. The war was brutal. Battles were fought across England. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. Finally, in 1016, they agreed to divide the kingdom. Edmund would rule Wessex. Knut would rule the rest. Edmund died weeks later. Knut became King of all England. He was in his early 20s. He would rule for nearly 20 years. His reign was remarkably stable. He married Emma of Normandy, Ethelred's widow. This legitimized his rule in English eyes. He kept many English nobles in positions of power. He converted fully to Christianity and supported the church generously. Canute also became King of Denmark in 1018 and King of Norway in 1028. He ruled a North Sea empire. His power was based on control of trade routes and the ability to move forces quickly by ship. He was wealthy. He was respected. He made pilgrimages to Rome. He was accepted as a legitimate Christian king by the rest of Europe. But his empire was personal. It depended on his ability to manage multiple kingdoms simultaneously. When he died in 1035, the empire fragmented. His sons fought over the succession. England, Denmark, and Norway went their separate ways. The North Sea Empire lasted only one generation. In Norway, the period was marked by conflict between kings and powerful nobles. Magnus the Good ruled from 1035 to 1047. He was followed by Harald Hardrada, who would become the last great Viking warrior king. Harald Hardrada had spent years in the East. He had served in the Varangian Guard in Constantinople. He had fought in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. He had accumulated wealth and experience. When he returned to Norway, he claimed the throne. He ruled from 1046 to 1060x. Harald was ambitious. He wanted to expand Norwegian power. He fought wars in Denmark. He made claims to the English throne based on old agreements between Cnut and Magnus. In 1066, he saw an opportunity. Edward the Confessor, King of England, had died without an heir. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful English noble, claimed the throne. But there were other claimants. Harold Hardrada was one. William of Normandy was another. Harold Hardrada invaded England in September 1066. He brought a large fleet. He sailed up the Humber and defeated an English army at Fulford. He seemed poised to take York, but Harold Godwinson moved quickly. He marched north with his army. The two forces met at Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066. The battle was fierce. The Norse fought well, but they were caught by surprise. Many had left their armor on the ships. The English had the advantage. Harold Hardrada was killed. His army was destroyed. The survivors fled to their ships. Of the 300 ships that had come, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Stamford Bridge is often marked as the end of the Viking Age. It was the last major Viking invasion of England, the last attempt by a Scandinavian king to conquer territory through military force in the old way. Harold Hardrada was the last of the great Viking warrior kings. His death closed an era. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy landed on the southern coast of England. Harold Godwinson marched south to meet him. The two armies fought at Hastings. On October 14th, Harold was killed. William became King of England. William was a Norman, but the Normans were descendants of Vikings. Rollo, a Norse chieftain, had been granted land in northern France in 911. His descendants had adopted French language and customs, but they retained Norse military traditions and ambitions. The Norman conquest of England was, in a sense, a final Viking achievement. By 1066, Scandinavia had changed. The kingdoms were stable and Christian. The age of raiding was over. Trade was more important than plunder. Scandinavian kings were part of the European political system. They married into other royal families. They participated in the broader currents of medieval politics. The longships were still built, but they were used less for raiding and more for trade and transport. The skills remained. The traditions continued. But the context had changed. The world had changed. The Norse settlements abroad had been absorbed or transformed. The Danelaw in England was now English, though with Norse influences in language and law. Normandy was French. The Rus principalities in the east were becoming Slavic. Iceland remained Norse but isolated. Greenland was struggling. The Atlantic settlements were at the edge of viability. The Viking Age had lasted roughly 300 years. It had transformed northern Europe. It had connected distant regions through trade and settlement. It had spread Norse culture across vast distances. But it had also changed the Norse themselves. They had become Christian. They had become part of the medieval European world. They had become something different from what they had been. The wind still moved across the water. The ships still sailed. But the age of expansion was over. The age of consolidation had begun. The Vikings were becoming Scandinavians. The raiders were becoming merchants and farmers and kings. The transformation was complete. There was no single moment when the Viking Age ended. No declaration. No treaty. It faded gradually, like daylight at the end of a long northern day. The changes that had been building for generations reached a point where the old patterns no longer held. By the late 11th century, Scandinavia was integrated into medieval Europe. The kingdoms were Christian. The kings were part of the European political system. They corresponded with popes and emperors. They married into other royal families. They participated in the same diplomatic and military networks as other European rulers. The church had become powerful. Bishops held authority. Monasteries owned land. The old temples were gone. The old rituals had been abandoned, at least publicly. The gods were remembered in stories, but they were no longer worshipped. The worldview had shifted. The economy had changed as well. Trade was more important than raiding. Scandinavian merchants moved goods across established routes. They had permanent trading posts. They operated within legal frameworks. The quick raid and retreat had given way to long-term commercial relationships. The ships were still built. The Norse were still exceptional sailors. But the longship was no longer the dominant vessel. Cargo ships, broader and deeper, carried more of the trade. The emphasis had shifted from speed and flexibility to capacity and efficiency. The social structure had evolved. Kings had more power. The old thing assemblies still existed, but royal authority was stronger. Laws were being written down. Administration was becoming more formal. The loose networks of loyalty that had characterized early Norse society were being replaced by more hierarchical structures. The settlements abroad had been absorbed. In England, the Danelaw had been reconquered by the Anglo-Saxon kings in the 10th century. The Norse settlers had become English. They kept some of their customs and language, but they were no longer separate. The Norman conquest in 1066 completed the transformation. England was now part of a different political world. In Normandy, the descendants of Rollo had become French. They spoke French. They followed French customs. They were Christian lords in the Frankish tradition. Their Norse heritage was a memory, not a living reality. In Ireland, the Norse towns like Dublin remained important. But they were Irish towns now. The population was mixed. The culture was blended. The Norse identity had merged with the Irish. In the east, the Rus principalities were becoming Slavic. The ruling families retained Norse names for a few generations, but they married into Slavic nobility. They adopted Slavic language and customs. By the 12th century, the Norse origins were barely visible. Iceland remained Norse. It was isolated enough to preserve its language and traditions. But it too was Christian. It too was part of the medieval European world. The sagas were being written down, preserving the memory of the pagan past. But they were written by Christians for a Christian audience. Greenland was struggling. The climate was cooling. The Little Ice Age was beginning. Farming became more difficult. Contact with Iceland and Norway became less frequent. The settlements would eventually fail, though that would not happen until the 15th century. The Viking Age had been driven by specific circumstances: population pressure, limited farmland, political instability, technological capability, opportunity. By the late 11th century, those circumstances had changed. Scandinavia was no longer overpopulated relative to its resources. The kingdoms were more stable. The opportunities abroad had been exhausted or transformed. The rest of Europe had also adapted. Coastal defenses were better. Kingdoms were more organized. The element of surprise was gone. Everyone knew about the Norse. Everyone had developed strategies to counter them. The advantages that had made the early raids so successful no longer existed. The culture had changed as well. The values that had driven the Viking Age, the emphasis on personal glory, the acceptance of violence, the willingness to risk everything for wealth and status, were being replaced by Christian values, humility, obedience, salvation. The heroic ideal was giving way to the saintly ideal. This was not a sudden shift. The old values persisted. The sagas celebrated the heroes of the past, but they were stories now, memories, not guides for current behavior. By 1100, the transformation was largely complete. Scandinavia was a collection of Christian kingdoms: Norway, Denmark, Sweden. They had their own internal conflicts and ambitions, but they were no longer launching raids on foreign shores. They were no longer sending out explorers to find new lands. They were settled, stable, part of the established order. The Viking Age had reshaped Northern Europe. It had created new trade networks. It had spread Norse culture across vast distances. It had forced other societies to adapt and strengthen. It had demonstrated the power of ships and the sea. It had shown that distance was not an absolute barrier. But it had also changed the Norse themselves. They had gone out into the world and been changed by what they found. They had encountered Christianity and adopted it. They had encountered more complex political systems and adapted them. They had encountered wealth and learned to pursue it through trade rather than raid. The end of the Viking Age was not a defeat. It was a transformation. The Norse did not disappear. They became Scandinavians. They became part of medieval Europe. They kept their languages and some of their traditions. But they were no longer the raiders and explorers who had terrified and fascinated the rest of Europe. The wind still moved across the water. The waves still rolled against the shore. The ships still sailed. But the age of expansion was over. The age of settlement had passed. What remained was memory, stories told around fires, sagas written on vellum, runestones standing in fields. The Viking Age had ended, but its legacy would endure. 300 years is a long time in human terms. It is many generations. It is the span from childhood to old age, repeated over and over. But in the scale of history, it is brief, a moment, a single chapter in a much longer story. The Viking Age was that moment. It began quietly, with a few ships moving along familiar coasts. It ended quietly, with the gradual absorption of Norse culture into the broader currents of medieval Europe. Between those points, the world changed. But the change was not dramatic. It was incremental. It was the accumulation of countless individual decisions and actions. A farmer deciding to leave Norway for Iceland, a trader following a river into unknown territory, a king choosing baptism, a family settling in England. Each decision was small, but together they reshaped the map of Europe. The Norse left traces everywhere they went, in language. English is full of Norse words: sky, egg, window, husband, they. These are Norse contributions. Place names across northern England and Ireland mark where Norse settlers lived: Grimsby, Whitby, Wicklow. The names remain long after the people who gave them have been forgotten, in law and custom. The concept of the jury, of judgment by peers, has roots in Norse legal traditions. The Thing assemblies, where free men gathered to settle disputes, influenced the development of parliamentary systems. In genetics, DNA studies show Norse ancestry across the regions they settled. In Iceland, the population is largely descended from Norse settlers and the Irish women they brought or married. In northern England, Norse genetic markers are common. The people are gone, but their descendants remain. in art and craft. The distinctive Norse style, with its interlaced patterns and stylized animals, influenced medieval art across Europe. Norse metalwork, wood carving, and textile techniques spread and were adopted by other cultures. But perhaps the most important legacy is less tangible. The Viking Age demonstrated what was possible. It showed that the Atlantic could be crossed, that distant lands could be reached and settled, that trade networks could span continents, that small decentralized societies could project power across vast distances. The Norse were not the first to explore or the first to trade, but they did so on a scale and with a reach that was unprecedented in Northern Europe. They connected regions that had been isolated. They created networks that would outlast them. They also demonstrated adaptability. The Norse who settled in Iceland created a unique political system. The Norse who moved east became the Rus and founded principalities that would evolve into Russia. The Norse who settled in Normandy became French and then conquered England. In each case, they adapted to local conditions while retaining elements of their identity. This flexibility was a strength. It allowed Norse culture to survive in many forms. It prevented the kind of rigid adherence to tradition that can make a culture brittle and unable to change. The Viking Age also reminds us that history is not linear. It does not move in a straight line from primitive to advanced. The Norse were sophisticated in many ways. Their ships were marvels of engineering. Their navigation techniques were remarkable. Their legal systems were functional and relatively egalitarian. They were not barbarians stumbling toward civilization. They were a complex society responding to their circumstances. And yet they changed. They adopted Christianity. They developed more centralized political structures. They became part of the medieval European world. This was not a betrayal of their identity. It was an evolution. Cultures change. They adapt. They absorb influences and create something new. The stories remain. The sagas, written down in Iceland, preserve the memory of the Viking Age. They tell of heroes and voyages, of feuds and settlements, of gods and fate. They are literature, not history. But they capture something true about the values and worldview of the Norse. Reading them now, centuries later, we can still hear the voices. We can still sense the cold wind and the rolling sea. We can still feel the pull of distant horizons. The sagas keep the Viking Age alive in a way that archaeological evidence alone cannot. But we must also remember what the sagas do not tell us. They focus on the exceptional, the heroes, the great deeds. They do not tell us much about the ordinary people, the farmers who never left home, the women who managed households, the children who grew up and grew old in the same valley their ancestors had known. These people were the majority. Their lives were the foundation on which the Viking Age was built. Without them, there would have been no surplus to fund voyages, no ships to build, no stories to tell. They are mostly anonymous, but they were essential. The Viking Age ended because the circumstances that created it changed. But the people did not disappear. They continued. They farmed and fished and raised families. They told stories and honored their ancestors. They adapted to new beliefs and new systems. They became something different while remaining, in some essential way, themselves. The wind still moves across the water. The waves still roll against the shore. The coastlines are the same. The fjords and islands and rivers are unchanged. The land remembers, even if the people have forgotten. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it is enough to know that for 300 years, a people from the cold north ventured out into the world. They explored and traded and settled. They left their mark. And then they came home, or they stayed and became part of new homes, and the age passed into memory. The story is over. The Viking Age has ended, but the echoes remain, in words and names, in genes and customs, in the shape of the world they helped create, and in the quiet knowledge that the sea can be crossed, that distant shores can be reached, that the world is larger and more connected than it seems. Rest now. The story is told. The journey is complete. The wind is still moving. The waves are still rolling. And somewhere in the long northern night, the memory endures.